Welcome to the Kurisko and Company podcast. I'm Lee Kurisko, MD. Today I'm going to do something very different from what we've done in the past. And I'm going to tell you my story about why I became a Christian late in life at the age of 66. You may be wondering, I thought this channel was about health issues. And indeed it is. But the reason that fits in with this channel is because it is generally quite well accepted and scientifically recognized that participation in organized religion and spirituality is connected with better health outcomes. So in the broadest sense of the word, religion is part of health. It could be argued that this is the most important talk that I've ever given. Believing in God and Jesus has profoundly changed my perspective on my place in the universe, both for now and eternity. So a little less than a year ago, I was baptized as a Christian at the age of 66. As a little bit of background, I'm originally from Canada, but I've been living in the United States now for 24 years. I'm a diagnostic radiologist and very influenced by science. Now, if you were to go back as recently as 4 years ago, and if you had said that I would become a Christian and be doing public speaking about doing so, about my conversion, I would have told you that you're out of your mind. I thought that belief in the Bible was for the gullible and the naive. And I incorrectly believed that to be an agnostic or atheist was the more sophisticated and rational way to look at things. How wrong I was. By becoming a Christian late in life, I've got a unique perspective. I don't believe in God and Christ as something that I absorb from my family or from my culture and without questioning. I've come to Christ because I've looked at this objectively, and along with some interesting experiences, I came to the inescapable conclusion that God is real and Christianity is true. In fact, once I learned what I have learned, and with some of the experiences that I've had, it would be unreasonable to not believe in Christianity. Now, if you're not a believer, I don't expect you to suddenly convert on the basis of this one video, but I encourage you to look into things as I have and come to your own conclusion. Here's a few caveats. I'm not a pastor, I'm not an astronomer, an astrophysicist, or cellular biologist, although I did do my undergraduate degree in biological sciences. I've learned enough about these things to understand that these disciplines do not refute the existence of God, but point to the existence of God. I will be providing a very high-level view at this point of what amounts to thousands of pages of reading. I encourage you to dig deep into these topics that all point towards the existence of God. I also believe that the historical evidence all points to Jesus having been a real person and that he was who he said he was, and that he did in fact rise from the dead. My journey to Christianity goes way back, and I now realize that I have been on a slow path in this direction for my whole life. I quite distinctly wondering as a small child, probably 6-8 years old, thinking, why do I exist? Why does anything exist? Where did I come from? Where did anything come from? Gottfried Leibniz, who was one of the discoverers of or developers of calculus, said, why is there anything at all rather than nothing whatsoever? These are profound and important questions. I came from a secular family. We didn't go to church. Occasionally I would go for a funeral or whatever, or a wedding, but we did not go on a weekly basis at all. And when I was in my 20s, my older brother, who was 3 years older than me, he became a Christian. And I kind of thought he went off the deep end by doing so. But on the other hand, he was a very smart guy. Unfortunately, he's deceased now. But he planted a seed in my head that this was not just for the gullible or naive. I had always sort of looked at Christianity as kind of like a fantasy, sort of like Harry Potter. The Bible was something that somebody just made up. There was no more reason to believe it was true than there was reason to believe that Harry Potter was true. But I didn't understand a very important distinction. I now understand that faith is not the opposite of reason. faith is the opposite of unbelief and not the opposite of reason. Reason and faith in God and Jesus are completely compatible and rational. I have faith that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Why? Because it rose every day of my 67 years on this planet and every day for millennia before that. To have faith in the sun rising is reasonable and rational. Hopefully, I can convince you that faith in God and Jesus is also rational and reasonable. In light of the types of things that I will be talking about today, atheism requires much more blind faith than is required to be a Christian. In fact, there's a good book along those lines called I Don't Have the Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norman Geisler. It's actually a really good book. I had no insight into this when my brother was alive, but nonetheless, my brother was smart, and like I say, he kind of planted a seed early in my life, in my early 20s. At the time of his death, I really saw that Christians had something that I didn't have. When he died, there was tremendous outpouring of support from his church family, and they had the comfort of knowing that death was not the end. There was an interesting event in my life in December 1995. The full importance of which did not occur to me at the time. I was doing my radiology residency in Winnipeg, Canada at the time, and it was around Christmas time. And my wife had driven to Thunder Bay, Ontario, where we were both from, to visit her mother and family. And I had to work, and so I drove separately. It's about a 400-mile drive from Winnipeg to Thunder Bay. And the day I was to drive there, I was waking, sort of in a twilight state, waking up, and I had this vision of being in a car and a semi-truck coming directly towards me. And just before the moment of impact, I woke up with a start. And I was like, phew, thank goodness that was just a dream. So I got in my car and I drove the 400 miles to Thunder Bay without incident. And I stopped in at my mother-in-law's place where my wife was staying and her brother was staying. And I remember we met in the kitchen and we were chatting for a while. And then we piled into my brother-in-law's car to drive to my parents' place, which was on the other side of Thunder Bay, I don't know, about 20 miles away or so. And there's this one hill on sort of the other side of Thunder Bay, off towards where my parents lived out in the country. And it's uphill. And we're driving along. My brother-in-law was driving. And he was talking to my wife, and I was in the back seat. He's talking away, and he's not looking where he's going. Meanwhile, there's a semi-truck in our lane, not supposed to be in our lane, heading right towards us. And we were microseconds from impact. And I yelled out to my brother-in-law, "Dad, look out!" And he cranked on the steering wheel, and we missed hitting that transport truck by microseconds. And we would have all been demolished, just killed instantly. And in fact, my unborn son that we didn't know that my wife was pregnant at the time, he would have never come into existence. So this episode taught me two things. One is that there are limitations to the naturalist, materialistic world. That being the viewpoint that the world is only that which we can sort of touch, see, and feel with our senses. That there's much more to that, to existence, than we can directly perceive, because I had this vision of something happening before it happened. And it gave credibility to me of the plausibility of prophecy. And, a big part of the Old Testament is that it predicts events in the New Testament. And that basic concept wasn't hard for me to accept, because I know that precognition is a real thing. There's no doubt in my mind about it. I don't think it happens very often. But the fact that there were these prophecies in the Old Testament predicting the events in the New Testament, it didn't strain my credibility when the time came later in life that I started to actually read the Bible. Now, my dog Buddy, he thinks he's got the world figured out. He lives with me and my wife. He gets 2 meals a day. He goes for a walk every morning. He loves meeting people, and he loves meeting other dogs. what else is there to know? But the way I look at it is we may have a consciousness broader than buddies, but there's still limitations on our perceptions of reality. We just like Buddy, we can only perceive a very small sliver of reality. And in fact, modern physics supports that view. It's recognized that we could perceive the 4 dimensions, length, breadth, width, and time. And we sort of operate in those dimensions. But the physicists recognize that there's actually something like 24 different dimensions. It's hard for us to even conceive of what those dimensions are about. But they're real, and presumably are acting upon our existence in ways that we don't even know about. The other thing is there's more to matter and energy than we can directly perceive. Some of the corollaries of the Big Bang Theory, which I'm going to talk a little bit more later, is that most of the energy in the universe and most of the matter in the universe is not directly perceivable by us. They're called dark matter and dark energy. And yet they're recognized as being real by physicists. So we only have a very sliver of an insight into the full nature of reality. And this opens the door to the possibility that outside forces act upon us in a realm that we are not able to directly perceive. Now, going back a few years, about 4 years ago, I'd been living alone for a while. And I was not a believer in God. I didn't discount that possibility, but I certainly was not a believer per se. And I remember getting up one morning. I like to work out in the morning before I go to work. It was November. It was cold and dark, and I had my weights set up in the garage. And this is November, and it's cold in Minnesota in November. And just on the spur of a moment, I said a prayer, and I said, God, I don't know if you're real, but if you're real, please help me find somebody that I'm truly compatible with. And then later in that day, I sort of admonished myself for being so silly, and I didn't give it too much thought. But then a few days later, I get a text on my phone, and it's from my current wife. She's there. Oh, Dr. Kurisko, are you going to be in town on Friday? Would you like to get together? And I had talked to her on the phone 2 or 3 times over the previous 6 months about a certain matter. Never seen her face to face, but whenever we talked, we sort of just kind of started talking very spontaneously. And I said, sure, let's meet at such and such a place. So anyway, the point is, God was, even though I had already met this woman, he was functioning outside of time and space as we know it to bring us together. And then when we got together, we just totally hit it off. I mean, we just completely hit it off. And within a few months, we were married, and it's been almost 4 years now, and it's been great. So I thank God for that intervention. Now, as we were getting to know each other, the other thing that happened is after we got together for dinner, it turned out I was off for the subsequent week. She was living in a different state. But because I was off, the opportunity was there for us to talk on the phone every day, which we did for several hours, which sort of, consolidated the relationship, and it moved forward. So we ended up getting married, and one of the things that happened as we were courting is she had mentioned that she was a devout Christian. That sort of made my heart sink a bit because I wasn't a believer. But she was quite accepting, and the relationship progressed, and we got married. And she was sort of shopping for a church home. She would go to church. I wouldn't go with her initially. And then there was a church in Minneapolis that she really, really liked and started going regularly and got me going. And they had a program there called the Alpha Program, which is kind of an introduction to Christianity. I mean, it doesn't give you all the answers, but it sort of gets you thinking. And the way it worked is I think we met twice a week for several weeks. And they would show a video. And then you'd break out into groups and discuss it. And you'd have these conversations, and it would get you thinking. So anyways, it motivated me to read the New Testament, which I did. And the thing that really struck me about the New Testament particularly regarding the travels of Paul, was this would be kind of weird to just make it up. I mean, all these details about these specific places that he went and people that he talked to, it just would seem odd to just make that up out of your head. And it kind of struck me that these were actually historical documents and not fiction. And around this time, my wife encouraged me to watch a video by the Hoover Institute featuring Stephen Meyer, who's a brilliant guy with some other eminent scientists, and they were talking about the limitations of Darwinism, which I'm going to get into in a bit. But Stephen Meyer wrote 3 books that I have read that have been very influential. The first one being The Return of the God Hypothesis. The next was A Signature in the Cell, and the other one was Darwin's Doubt. So I subsequently read these books in quite a bit of detail. And the thing with The Return of the God Hypothesis, what the basic premise is that prior to Charles Darwin, particularly in 1859 when he wrote The Origin of the Species, there was a shift in science where prior to that time, it was not seen as a conflict to be a scientist and a believer in God. The way that earlier scientists, people like, Newton and Kepler and Galileo and Boyle, the way they looked at things is, as scientists, it was their mission to figure out the universe as God had created it. And they recognized that God had created a rational universe that was intelligible, that they would be able to figure things out. It was not just random and disorganized and chaotic. There was order to the universe, order to the laws of the universe that, as scientists, they could figure out. But when Charles Darwin came along, things moved in a different direction. And the move was towards materialist naturalism, the belief that all there is that which we can directly perceive and touch and feel. But as I've said, I mean, in my own experiences, obviously there's much more to the world than just materialist naturalism. Here are a few important points that I learned from Stephen Meyer reading his books. It is now generally accepted that the universe had a distinct beginning. The universe is not eternal. And the Doppler red shift confirmed that, and is also supported by Einstein's general theory of relativity. From the beginning of the universe has been finely tuned to allow for the existence of the universe as we know it, and to allow for life to exist. There's evidence from biology that large amounts of functional genetic information has arisen in our biosphere to make new life forms possible, implying the existence of a designing intelligence. And that there's serious limitations to the scientific models used to explain the start of life and the concept of irreducible complexity. I'm going to talk a bit about all of these things. Now, with the advent of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, the assumption was made that with enough scientific inquiry, we could eventually figure everything out in the natural world and come up with material naturalist explanations. Interestingly, Charles Darwin himself had some reservations about his own theory of natural selection and admitted that if a biological feature could not be accounted for by natural selection, his theory would fall apart. I'm going to get back to that. I'm not saying that evolution through natural selection isn't true, but it's very limited. It can explain things like why a giraffe has a long neck. If there's a survival advantage to having a longer neck, the giraffes with a longer neck will tend to propagate and give birth to giraffes with longer necks. Likewise, on the Galapagos Islands, there were different varieties of these finches with different features like long beaks, specialized for digging out insects from holes in wood and stuff like that. And you can see how there'd be a selection pressure for those features to be amplified over time. But natural selection does not explain the development of radically different body forms without intermediate steps, as has been documented at the time of the Cambrian explosion. In 2014, an op-ed in the New York Times by evolutionary psychologist Professor David Brash, arguing that belief in God has been rendered implausible by science. As evolutionary science has progressed, the available space for religious belief has narrowed, he said. It has demolished potent pillars of religious faith and undermined belief in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. I argue that the opposite is true. Which is that as science has progressed, we have more reason than ever to believe in God. In fact, not only to believe in God, but to be certain of his existence. I will also argue, once you accept that God exists and the miracle of his creation, the idea of God entering his own creation as a man and performing miracles and dying and being resurrected becomes plausible and in fact is supported by historical evidence. The standard model of cosmology is that the universe had a distinct beginning. And one thing that pointed in that direction is something called the Doppler shift. You're all familiar with the Doppler effect. A train is coming towards you and it has a certain tone, and then as it passes you, the tone changes. Or same way with a car. A car could be coming towards you, making a sound, and then the sound shifts. And what's happening is that the wavelength is being stretched out as the car moves away from you, and the wavelength is being compressed as it moves towards you, and your ear perceives that as a different sound. Well, that same phenomenon occurs with electromagnetic radiation, and Edwin Hubble noted that the stars and the galaxies had a similar effect, that as moving away, there was a shift in electromagnetic radiation more toward the red end of the spectrum. And what can you extrapolate from that? If the universe is expanding, if you go back in time, it implies that it was in a more contracted state. And as you go back further and further in time, the entire universe was a single point, which implies that it had a distinct beginning. At one time, there was nothing in existence, and that the universe just instantaneously came into being. General relativity, which I don't claim to understand, apparently supports the fact that there was an instantaneous beginning to the universe. And Albert Einstein stated that the biggest mistake of his career was assuming that the universe was static and eternal, at least initially. And in his calculations that he initially used, he used what's called the cosmological constant and fudged it to fit a static universe. But then, when confronted with the evidence from Edwin Hubble, he had to change that constant. And the cosmological constant, I don't profess really understand what it means, but it has something to do with the energy flux through space. So the generally accepted view is that the universe is expanding and had an instantaneous beginning. Now, generally scientists have sort of pushed back and sort of kind of feared this idea that the universe had an instantaneous beginning because of the theological implications, that by having a beginning, the implication is, well, something started it. Now, it's hard to conceive of nothing before the universe exists, with no time, no space, no matter, no energy. The natural world simply did not exist, and yet it came into existence in an instant. Now, that's only possible because something outside of time, space, matter, and energy willed it into existence. A consciousness beyond anything that we can grasp started the universe. An infinite, omnipotent intelligence beyond anything that we can conceive, something that is outside of nature, something that is extra-natural or supernatural. On this point, modern science is strangely reminiscent of the first words of Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So modern science tells us that Genesis 1 was correct, that the universe had an instantaneous beginning. There's something else very strange about Genesis and the creation of the universe. According to astrophysicist and biblical scholar Gerald Schroeder, due to the relative nature of time that physics teaches us, from the perspective of the leading edge of the expanding universe, only 6 24-hour days have transpired since the Big Bang. Isn't that interesting? The Kalam cosmological argument was created in the 11th century by this Muslim fellow named Kalam, and it goes as follows. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This cause must be eternal and uncaused. God is the most reasonable explanation for an uncaused first cause. How do we explain God? Well, we can't. He just is. I like the Jewish term for God's name, Yahweh, meaning I am. He is eternal, omnipotent, and omniscient. He always was and always will be. He is outside of the natural world of time, space, matter, and energy. He is supernatural. This is important to understand when I talk about Jesus a little bit later. I'm going to talk about the fine-tuning of the existence of the universe and the existence of life. Now, to win the Powerball lottery, the chances of winning it is only 1 in 292 million. Now, just imagine if there was somebody that won it 10 times in a row. What would you think? Would you think that they're just incredibly lucky? Or do you think that there was intelligent actions that made that manifest and come into a reality? Well, obviously, there was intervention, intelligent planned intervention. Stephen Hawking, an avowed atheist, pointed out, if the proton-neutron mass difference were not about twice the mass of the electron, one would not obtain the couple of hundred or so nuclides that make up the elements and are the basis of chemistry and biology. If that one little thing had not been just so, we would not exist. The universe would not exist as we know it. There are a number of aspects of the universe that had to be exactly right, or the universe as we know it wouldn't exist. The electromagnetic force had to be precise to 1 part in 25. The strong nuclear force constant had to be precise to 1 part in 200. The weak nuclear force constant to strong nuclear force constant ratio is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10,000. Let me restate that. The weak nuclear force to the strong nuclear force ratio is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10,000. The gravitational force constant had to be precisely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 35th power. In other words, 1 followed by 35 zeros. That's a huge number. If it was off even a bit, things wouldn't work. The ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity is 1 part in 10 to the 40th power. The cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. And as I said, this has something to do with the energy flux through space. The initial entropy of the universe, which is a measure of disorder, had to be finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 raised to the power of 123. This is an astronomically huge number. As Stephen Meyer points out, the initial entropy of the universe at the time of the Big Bang had to be so precisely tuned to the equivalent of, if it was plus or minus the weight of 1 dime of matter, if the amount of matter in the universe was off by the equivalent of 1 dime. If it was 1 dime less, all of the components of the universe would have just spread apart and never have sort of congealed into planets and solar systems. If it was 1 dime too much, all of it would have just collapsed together into basically a black hole. What are the chances of all these things happening by pure, unplanned chance? Pretty unlikely. Other things that had to be precisely finely tuned for the universe to exist as we know it. The mass of the up quark, the mass of the down quark, the electron mass, the mass of neutrinos, the expansion rate of the universe. Now, just to put these huge numbers in perspective, there's only 10 to the 80th power elementary particles in the known universe. These probabilities are infinitesimally small to be accurate to allow the universe to exist as it does. There are a number of factors for life to exist on Earth that had to be just right. The size of our sun, the distance from the sun, our position in the galaxy, the presence of a moon of a certain size, the presence of tectonic plates, the right amount of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. There are dozens upon dozens of parameters that had to be just right, or else we wouldn't exist. There's a point at which you have to simply acknowledge that our existence is not an accident, and that it was planned and instigated by a super intellect. Yale professor of quantum physics Henry Morgano said, "There is a mind which is responsible for the laws of nature and the existence of nature and the whole universe, and this is consistent with everything we know." Stephen Meyer attended a conference in 1985 featuring both atheist and theistic scientists discussing the nature of the universe. There was a famous astronomer there named Alan Sandage, who initially had been basically an atheist. But he came to acknowledge that the material universe had a definite beginning, implying a cause outside of the physical and material universe, and that the fine-tuning of the universe since the beginning of time and the precision of various physical parameters to allow for the existence of life was not mere chance. As a lifelong atheist and scientific materialist, he shocked everyone at the conference by sitting down on the side of the theists. This had a great impact on Stephen Meyer, who had a great impact on me. To deny the existence of God at this point becomes irrational. And with what I've explained so far, I'm convinced that God is real, but there's more. Atheist Richard Dawkins has stated that the machine code of genes is uncannily computer-like. Bill Gates has stated that DNA is like a computer program. And biotechnology specialist Leroy Hood describes the information in DNA as digital code. How did DNA arise? How did the information within it arise? How did functional proteins come to exist? You need DNA to create purposeful proteins. You need purposeful proteins to create DNA. Primordial soup experiments back in the 1950s showed that under the right circumstances, a few basic organic molecules like a few amino acids could be created. But there are concerns that those conditions never actually existed. And besides, it's an incredibly long leap to go from creating a few amino acids, which are basically the basic elemental building blocks of protein, to creating entire cells and complex organisms. And these experiments were started in 1952 by Urey and Miller. And the environmental conditions were probably very different. That they created basically in the test tube were very different from what actually existed. Now, based on this primordial soup model of biogenesis, the formation of even a 150 amino acid long protein is very unlikely. And in fact, it's been calculated through just spontaneous events. The chance of creating a single 150 amino acid long protein is only one chance in 10 to the 164th power. That's a huge number. This is a very improbable event. Recall that there are only 10 to the 80th of elementary particles in the known universe. Now, the chance of that single functional amino acid coming to existence just through random events is since the beginning of time, right? So an incredibly long time period to randomly create a single 150 amino acid long functional protein. Now, when you look at functional proteins 150 amino acids long, for every one functional protein, the combinatorial possibilities are 10 to the 77th power. So there are vastly more non-functional protein combinations of amino acids than there are functional combinations of amino acids. And remember that 150 amino acid is really just a modest length protein. There's a vast number of different functioning proteins in our body. Many of them are much larger than that and would have to be put together exactly right to work as they're intended to work. So to put these odds in perspective, there's only 10 to the 65th power atoms in the Milky Way galaxy, with only 1 in 10 to the 77th power of non-functional to functional protein combinations. To find a single functional protein is like marking one atom with paint, so to speak, amongst 1 trillion Milky Way galaxies and expecting to find it through random processes. Not likely. Now keep in mind that most mutations, which are changes in DNA which lead to changes in protein, or the sequence of amino acids, the vast majority of these mutations are fatal to the organism. And since the 3.85 billion years of life on Earth, there hasn't been nearly enough time for this process to occur to get a single functional amino acid, let alone the entire complexity of a living, functioning organism. It is completely implausible that a fully functional single-cell organism would arise spontaneously without intelligent input. And of course, there's more to organisms than just protein. You need DNA, you need transfer RNA, you need messenger RNA, you need ribosomes, you need cell membranes, you need cytoplasm, you need the energetic systems with ATP and anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic metabolism, et cetera, et cetera. They all have to be in place and functioning properly for a cell to function. Somewhere in my reading, I came across the chance of a single simple cell arising spontaneously through random chance is only 1 chance in 10 to the 11,000th power, 1 followed by 11,000 zeros. Biophysicist and origin of life researcher Dean Kenyon initially argued for the self-organization of complex molecules from simpler molecules in a primordial soup, but then changed his mind and realized that origin of life simulation experiments increasingly suggest that simple chemicals do not arrange themselves into complex information-bearing molecules, nor do they move in life-relevant directions, unless, that is, biochemists actively and intelligently guide the process. There are 3 key things that require explanation. The origin of the system for storing and encoding digital information as DNA. The origin of the information that has been encoded in the DNA. And the origin of the integrated complexity, the functional independence of parts that make the cell information processing system work. As I stated, you need functional proteins to have functioning DNA. You need functioning DNA to have functioning protein. And there's all types of intermediate things that have to be in place, and other things like cytoplasm and cell membranes and so on. They all have to be in place or it doesn't work at all. Now, whenever we look at something that has information, we know there's an intelligent designer. DNA is an information system. If you pick up a book written in an intelligible language, you automatically know that an intelligent entity created that book. The same is true with information on television, or if you see something that is manufactured in the form of a set of glasses or an iPhone, you know that there was an intelligent designer behind the whole thing. You don't even question it. And yet, given the vast improbability of our existence and that things have been put together just right, particularly cellular processes, it makes perfect sense that there's an intelligent designer behind it. We have really no good explanations for how these things came together, and the origin of life research has really not progressed much since the 1950s with those first initial experiments. Now, there's the concept of evolutionary gradualism, which is what Darwinism is based on, which is in complete conflict with irreducible complexity. The problem of irreducible complexity is the idea that something either comes together in totality right from the beginning, or it doesn't. In cells, these little bacteria, some of them have these little things called cilia, which are little branching fingers that move and allow the organism to propel itself. And if you look at a sperm cell, spermatozoa, it's got that long tail on it. Well, literally, these things are driven by engines. Electron microscopy has progressed to the point where they can look at these things and say, there's actually engines made out of protein with components that are exactly just right, that allow the engine to work and to drive the movement of the cilia or the sperm tail. Now, there's no such thing as half an engine. If you took apart half the components of your engine in your car, the car doesn't work. All the components have to be there or it doesn't work at all. And so there's no explanation through naturalist biological processes by which these things can come into existence and start to function. Directly from Charles Darwin, from the book The Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find no such case. But biology has progressed since the time of Charles Darwin, and I've described a number of cases of irreducible complexity that basically refute the basis of Darwinism. And I mentioned that the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago that lasted for 20 to 30 million years, there was just a vast array of new life forms that just came into existence basically instantaneously. We really don't understand through materialist, naturalist explanations how that was possible without the intervention of an intelligent designer. So after I learned about all of this biological information, I was pretty much sold on the existence of God. But what of Jesus? A God that created the universe with such fine precision is clearly omnipotent. He exists outside of time, space, matter, and energy. And it was now plausible to me that he could enter his own creation as a living person. John 1, talking of God, Jesus, creation, and our existence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. So God and Jesus are one, and from God came everything, including us. Although miracles seem to violate the laws of biology and physics, God is outside of these laws, and he created the laws. He's outside of nature as we think of it. He's outside of nature or extranatural or supernatural, and therefore certainly could do miracles, including turning water into wine, walking on water, or bringing a dead body back to life. When I skeptically started reading the New Testament, the first thing that I noticed, as I mentioned, was that it seemed to me that this was a historical document. Now, J. Warner Wallace is a retired detective who wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, which is a really good book. And he initially was an atheist, but somebody managed to drag him to church, and he started going to church. So he thought that he would sort of investigate this the same way that he would investigate the cases that he looked into as a detective. And in fact, he not only was a detective, he's what they call a cold case detective. He would go into these cases where they couldn't come to any conclusion, and the case had just been dropped for 10 years, 20 years or whatever. And then when further evidence came to light, he would dig into it and solve these cases. So he took the same approach looking at the New Testament. And remember, he started initially as an atheist, but early in his investigation, he came to accept the following truths. Jesus died on the cross and was put in a tomb. Jesus' tomb was empty and no one ever produced his body. Jesus' disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead, and his disciples were transformed following his alleged resurrection. He realized that he had to let go of his presupposition against the supernatural, and he was aware of some of the cosmological information that I've just shared with you. So he opened his mind to the possibility that miracles actually happen. Now, there's some things that he points out that are very important. When you look at the Gospels, they're all a little bit different. That does not undermine their credibility. It actually enhances it. When they're investigating a crime, if all the witnesses say exactly the same thing, it implies that there's been collusion and that they're not necessarily telling the truth. So the variation in the stories in the different Gospels actually makes them more credible. There's a lot of external validation to the events in the New Testament. In other words, validation from outside of the Bible itself. From his book, he says, from sources outside of the Bible, it is established that Jesus was a real historical person. He was a virtuous man who worked wonders. He accurately predicted the future. He taught his disciples. He drew large crowds of Jews and Gentiles. He was identified as Christ and believed to be the Messiah, and was also known as the wise king of the Jews. His disciples were eventually called Christians, and his devoted followers became a threat to the Jewish leadership, and these leaders presented accusations to the Roman authorities. Pontius Pilate condemned Jesus to crucifixion during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Jesus was in fact crucified, and a great darkness descended over the land, and there was an earthquake upon his death. Following his death, a mischievous superstition spread about him from Palestine to Rome. That was all verified from outside of the Bible. Here's some other important points. The crucifixion was not survivable. And basically, if you were one of those Roman soldiers that did the crucifixions, apparently, if you were unsuccessful making sure someone died, you were at risk of being sacrificed yourself. As you know, Christ was crucified. He was thought dead. Just to be 100% certain, one of the soldiers stuck a spear in his side, and there was a big gush of blood and what we now know to be pleural fluid. So it was just simply not possible to survive a Roman crucifixion, and no one ever did. So he was in fact dead. It is not credible that the resurrected Christ was an imposter. It's actually pretty easy to tell an imposter. I mean, could you even a twin cannot completely mimic his brother or sibling. The people that know them are going to know that they're not the same person. So the resurrected Christ as an imposter is not plausible. There's no such thing as multiple people suffering from the same delusion. That's something that psychiatry doesn't recognize. Delusions are individual are unique to different individuals. There's no such thing as a group delusion. And so many people witnessed the resurrected Christ. It doesn't make sense that they were all hallucinating. A conspiracy theory is not plausible. The writers of the Bible were separated in time and space, and yet there was an internal consistency within the Bible of the various events. It's possible to have a conspiracy with one or two or maybe three people, especially now with modern communications and so on, but they didn't have that then. And so a complex conspiracy about the death of Christ and his resurrection is just not really plausible. Now, between the years of year 1 to 33 was the life of Jesus. From 45 to 50 AD, Mark wrote his gospel. Between the year 50 and 53 AD, Luke wrote his gospel. And between 53 and 57 AD, Paul quotes Luke. Between 57 and 60 AD, Luke writes Acts. And all of these things had a chronological coherentness to it. Between the years of 67 and 70 AD was the siege of Jerusalem, and the year 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And yet those things were not mentioned in any of the Gospels, so that we know that the Gospels were written within a time frame relatively close to the life of Christ. Whereas there's things that we accept as historical fact where the documentation has not been for hundreds of years later. Mr. Wallace talks about the chain of custody of evidence when there's a murder case or any type of case where, like the glove that they found when O.J. Simpson killed those people, it had to be in a sequestered, secure environment. If somebody wanted to examine it, they had to write what time they took it out, when they put it back, and there's a chain of custody for this evidence. Well, we have a chain of custody of the evidence from the days of Peter and Paul, with a variety of people that came in succession to one another, carrying the torch, so to speak, of the story of Christ, from the days of Peter and Paul up until the Council of Laodicea in AD 363, when they basically formulated the books that became the current Bible. These people were individuals like Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Tatian, Justus Martyr. So there's a continuous chain of custody for the information in the Gospels and the story of Jesus. There are archaeological findings that confirm small but important details, such as the existence of towns like Nazareth and government officials such as Pontius Pilate. Now, the apostles initially may have been timid, but they became bold defenders of Christianity after they saw the resurrected Christ. And in fact, they were willing to die in defense of their beliefs. Now, it's not uncommon historically for people to die for what they believe to be true, but people will not die for what they know to be false. And if they were just making this story up about the resurrected Christ, why would you bother dying for that? But they did die, and they died terrible deaths. People do not die for what they know to be false. Clearly, they knew the events of the resurrected Christ were true. Now, Mr. Wallace makes a point here. He says, I'm a Christian today for one reason. Christianity is true. I'm a Christian because I want to live in a way that reflects the truth, even if it's hard, inconvenient, or unpopular. I'm a Christian because my regard for the truth leaves me no alternative. An inconvenient truth is preferable to a convenient lie. So I learned about all this stuff over a period of, a few years, and it all made sense to me. I mean, I certainly was accepting of the existence of God, but even in light of all of this historical confirmation of Christ, I still was a little bit incredulous that God would come to earth in the form of man and do what he did and die for our sins. To me, it just didn't seem plausible. It didn't seem possible. And so I explained this to my wife, and she says, well, why don't you pray about it? Pray to God for some sort of confirmatory evidence, some sign that this is all true, that, that God is real, that Jesus is real, and that he was who he was, and that things happened as they are portrayed in the Bible. So I prayed, and then a few days later, we were driving up to our cabin in Canada, and we're driving along the north shore of Lake Michigan. It was early in the morning. It was a clear, sunny day, but there was a bank of cumulus clouds up in front of us. And I'm driving, and I look up, and I see written in nice cursive letters, ABBA, A-B-B-A. And I thought, wow, that's really weird. I haven't thought about that rock group from the 80s for a long time. Well, we finished our trip to the cabin. It's really long. It's like 14, 15-hour drive. Get to the cabin. I'm pooped out. And I'm going to go have a nap. And so prior to having my nap, I sat down and I opened up this actual New Testament Bible. Open it up to Mark 14:36. It says, Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I couldn't believe it. To me, the odds of that happening was infinitesimal. And I interpreted that as a direct communication with God that he is in fact real. I could no longer reject the reality of God or the reality of Jesus. Mathematician, physicist, and philosopher Blaise Pascal in the 1600s said, God has given us evidence which is sufficiently clear for those with an open mind and an open heart, but which is sufficiently vague not to compel those whose hearts are closed. Michael Ignor is a neurosurgeon whose book I just recently finished reading. It's called The Immortal Mind. It's a really good book. Early in the book, he gives a story about he's a young physician, doesn't believe in God. That's my dog, by the way. And he is called out to do a consult in a rural hospital. And he does his consult. It's in the evening, and he's been very preoccupied, very distressed, because his second son was approaching about 6 months of old, and months old, was not communicating, not making eye contact, not engaging with people, with him or his wife. He was really, really worried that this child had autism. And they'd sought a consult with a pediatrician who said, well, it's a bit early to know for sure if he's got autism or not. But Dr. Ignor was just really preoccupied about this whole thing. So he did his consult, and he's walking by the church chapel, and as an atheist, he goes in there and he kneels down. He basically said, God, I don't know if you exist, but I need help. I'm terrified that my son is autistic. It's agony to have a child who will never know or love me. Then he heard a voice in his head, literally heard the voice. He'd never heard voices in his head before. And it said, but that's what you've been doing to me. And so basically, instantaneously, he became a Christian convert. And interestingly, within the next few days, the boy started to interact normally with him and his wife and did not have autism. Facts are not enough. Part of the process is being open to the possibility, and then belief is a possibility for those who are open. Once presented with enough information, not believing, to me, becomes irrational. In fact, it becomes unscientific to not believe. One has to ask oneself, why am I rejecting the hard evidence? And what am I gaining by not believing? Could it be that there's some source of comfort believing that we're not ultimately accountable for our actions? There are other lines of evidence for the existence of God. After-death experiences are really interesting. I'm sure you've heard about these types of things where people have cardiac arrests and they sort of float out above their body and they observe the events in the emergency room or whatever. Or there's been cases where there's been verifiable facts that arise from it where they float up above their body and they say, oh, that piece of equipment you've been looking for is on top of that cabinet over there. And then they go and they look and they find that piece of equipment. The case of Pam Reynolds in 1991 is particularly compelling. Pam Reynolds was a young woman. I believe she was about 34 years old at the time, and she had a very large aneurysm at the tip of her basilar artery, which is in a very difficult place to operate on. And she was presenting with limb weakness and was becoming quite disabling. So there's two issues. She was becoming disabled by the aneurysm, but there was always the threat that this aneurysm would burst and cause her death. So the decision was made that this had to be operated on. And so in 1991, she did this operation. It was done by a Dr. Spetzler, who is a real guy. He, at the time, was head of the Barrow Neurological Institute in Arizona. I know he's a real guy because he basically wrote the book on vascular malformations of the brain because years ago I did a fellowship in neuroradiology. So what they did with Pam, because it was such a difficult procedure, they anesthetized her and they also cooled her body down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and they tipped her up and basically drained all of the blood out of her head so that there'd be no bleeding when they operate. They had a thing in her ears that made sounds, and they could measure the electrical activity in her brain. there was no electrical activity in her brain. So he was anesthetized, profoundly hypothermic. There was no measurable brain activity at all. For all intents and purposes, she was dead, and they performed this operation. Now, what's interesting is she was aware of what was going on, and in fact floated up out of her body and observed what was going on and was able to describe the operation in great detail. She survived the operation and did well for a while and died from some other thing at a relatively young age. But I found that episode particularly compelling. There's neurological evidence that consciousness and brain function are not really the same. You may have heard of Wilder Penfield. He was a physician. I believe that he was at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and he's the guy that did these experiments with over 1,000 people where he would open up their head and explore the functions of various parts of their cerebral cortex by electrical stimulation and see what action was evoked by doing so. And this was part of a process of figuring out like what could be resected, what could not be resected in people that were having intractable seizures. So he would find an area where he touch it with an electrode and the finger would move. And he was able to map out all these different areas, both motor and sensory cortices. But it was interesting. He was able to, well, first, just to backtrack, the brain itself has no sensation, and they would, use local anesthetic to numb up the skull and the lining of the brain. And that's how they were able to do this with these people being wide awake during the procedure. So he was able to evoke these movements, physical sensations, smells, memories, that type of thing. But he was very aware of the fact that he was not able to evoke complex concepts or opinions, or he could not make someone decide to move a limb. And when he would get someone to move a limb by stimulating a certain spot, he would say, well, who did that? Did you do that or did I do that? And they'd say, well, no, you did it. So the patient could still tell when they had initiated the movement versus Dr. Penfield. The implication being is that our mind is separate from the wiring diagram of our brain. There's more evidence along that line to suggest that our mind and our brain are different things. And I recommend reading that book, The Immortal Mind. There's the fact that there is a coherent morality baked into reality. Inherent morality baked into reality that's basically uniform across cultures. There is a basic understanding of what's right and what's wrong. Everybody knows that torturing babies is wrong. We all basically know that lying and cheating and stealing are wrong. Where did that come from? I would say that it was programmed into the nature of reality by God. And we don't behave in moral ways just on the basis of social contract. I used to think that, well, we don't lie, we don't cheat, we don't steal, we don't kill people because we want to live in a society where those things don't happen. And so it's a form of mutual cooperation or social contract that we behave in a certain way. But there's good evidence that there's more to human behavior than just social contract. People do things for other people completely altruistically, even to their own survival benefit, even to their own survival detriment. So life is not just about propagating our genes. Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, cites the case of Cameron Hollopeter and Wesley Autry in 2007 in New York City. What happened there was young Cameron, was waiting for a subway train, and he had a seizure, and he fell onto the tracks. And without thinking, Wesley Autry jumped onto the tracks and covered his body and protected him as the train went over, and they both survived. This was profoundly anti-Darwinian. It did not serve his survival value or the survival of his genes in any way. And the interesting thing was these two people didn't know each other at all. Cameron was a young white student. Wesley was a black military veteran construction worker. And yet he did this without thinking. Where does that come from? There's more to morality than just programming behaviors that work to propagate our genes. Why would Michelangelo spend 4 years painting the Sistine Chapel? Why would Mother Teresa spend her life working for the well-being of the downtrodden? We are made in the image of God, and like God, aspire to create and enjoy beauty and to work for the well-being of others. So we're not just automatons. Mathematics. Have you ever wondered about mathematics? Like, why can we think about a mathematical problem, put pen to paper, and figure it out, and then it may have a physical manifestation that's exactly correct? Like if you're at a fire cannon and you know the muzzle velocity and the mass of the cannonball, et cetera, wind velocity, you can figure out exactly where that thing's going to land. There's lots of higher mathematical problems that can be worked out, and they're all true. Why is that so? Why is the universe so coherent in that way? It suggests that there was thought and design behind it. We have cravings for food, water, air, love, companionship. Why? Because those things exist and they're real. We have a craving for the divine because God exists. I still have a lot of questions and accept that I will never have all of the answers. But lacking answers doesn't mean that the greater truth isn't true. Everything that I've shared with you points to the fact that God is real. Jesus is real. Think of a puzzle of the Mona Lisa. You could have a lot of pieces missing, but still recognize the truth that this is a picture of the Mona Lisa. Understanding God, Jesus, and our relationship to them is like that puzzle. We don't have to understand it completely, but it doesn't mean that it's not real. Why so much suffering in the world? I don't know for sure, but John Lennox, who is a mathematician and a Christian, makes the point that God has not separated himself from the problem of suffering because he's participated in the suffering, so he understands what we feel. Is suffering a manifestation of our free will? I'm not really sure. Perhaps the existence of suffering is what permits the existence of what is wonderful about humanity: courage, compassion, benevolence, and purpose in life. Psychologist Jordan Peterson points out that we don't have to dig too deep into most people's lives to reveal that they've encountered terribly trying circumstances and that they may never come to a happy resolution in their lifetime. This experience of becoming a Christian has changed my perspective on worldly problems. There's a sense of relief that life is eternal and that the challenges that we experience now, no matter how great, are an eye blink from the perspective of eternity. I feel that a weight has been lifted from my life, knowing that the end of my physical life is not the end, and that we don't necessarily have to fix everything in our lives, but everything will still be okay. If you're not a believer, perhaps give consideration to my words. I encourage you to dig into this. There's no need for so-called blind faith. Faith can be based on experience and knowledge. Thanks for listening. Post a comment, subscribe. Thank you.